Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, and today we're tackling the future of work and the psychology behind it. If you've noticed more and more companies demanding people return to the office, you're not alone. Executives keep saying it's about culture, collaboration, and productivity, but the evidence tells a different story. In fact, study after study shows that remote and flexible work, 4-day weeks, or even 32-hour weeks, universal basic income, and prioritizing rest and health all lead to better outcomes for workers, families, and yes, even for companies. So, why the push to go backward? And what does psychology tell us about why these outdated models won't stick? Let's get into it. Let's start with remote work itself. The data is clear. Flexibility matters. Research over the past decade has consistently found that employees working from home report higher satisfaction, less stress, and even higher output in some cases. A 2015 experiment with a Chinese travel agency found that remote workers were not only more productive, completing 13% more calls than their office counterparts, they were also significantly happier and less likely to quit. By 2024, research published in Nature showed that hybrid working arrangements improved retention without damaging performance. These aren't outliers. They're consistent findings across multiple studies and contexts. This tracks with decades of psychological research on autonomy. According to self-determination theory, developed starting in the 1980s, autonomy is one of the three fundamental psychological needs, along with competence and relatedness. When people feel in control of their own schedules and environments, they experience greater intrinsic motivation. They do better work and they feel better about doing it. And it's not just about convenience, it's about psychological safety, self-worth, and trust. When companies offer flexible work, they're not just giving people time back, they're signaling that they trust their workers to manage themselves. They're saying, "We hired you for your judgment and your skills, and we believe you will use them well." That trust pays real dividends in loyalty and engagement, as well as impact on the bottom line. The psychological contract between employer and employee only strengthens when autonomy is respected. It weakens dramatically when it's withdrawn arbitrarily. So why are we seeing a push back into the office? Some leaders genuinely believe the old myths about productivity that if they can't see you working, you must not be working. But the data doesn't support this anxiety. Research shows that return to office mandates often reduce employee engagement and retention rather than improving them. Workers perceive these mandates as unfair, especially after proving they can perform effectively from home. From a psychological standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Perceived fairness and procedural justice are foundational to organizational trust. When policies feel arbitrary or punitive, especially after employees have adapted successfully to new arrangements, it violates that sense of fairness. The result is resentment, disengagement, and a search for the exit. But here's where it gets a little darker. One quiet truth is that many companies use return to office mandates as a form of forced layoff. They know some workers can't or won't come back because of geography, caregiving responsibilities, disability accommodations, or health risk. By mandating attendance, companies can cut headcount without the bad press, severance costs, or legal complications of announcing layoffs. It's a strategic attrition play dressed up as a culture initiative. From a psychological perspective, this strategy is disastrous for everyone who stays. It erodes trust completely. It breeds resentment and anxiety, and workers know when they're being manipulated. They may stay for a while out of financial necessity, but the loyalty is gone, the psychological contract has been torn up. These employees become the walking dead, present in body but checked out mentally and emotionally. And let's not forget the other major driver, money. Companies are sitting on long commercial leases, expensive office build-outs, and downtown real estate investments that look increasingly foolish. Rather than admit the mistake and adapt, executives double down. They force employees back to justify the expense. This is classic loss aversion combined with the sunk cost fallacy. Loss aversion describes how losses loom larger than equivalent gains in decision making. Executives fear admitting that billions sunk into office space might no longer make sense as an office or might be better used as affordable housing. That admission feels like failure. So instead of adapting to new information and changing circumstances, they force their employees back. Sometimes they even use RTO as camouflage for reducing headcount, two birds, one stone. The problem with this strategy is it treats employees like pawns on a balance sheet, rather than people with agency and options. The long-term cost of this short-term avoidance is cultural erosion and talent flight. The best workers, the ones with the most options, leave first after this kind of pseudo-layoff. What remains is the less engaged, less capable workforce that we referenced earlier, and a reputation as an employer that prioritizes real estate and money over people. Workers don't forget being sacrificed to preserve someone else's bad investment. And now we're seeing another excuse emerge: artificial intelligence. In 2025 alone, over 130,000 tech workers have been laid off, with companies citing AI-driven restructuring as the cause. With companies citing AI-driven restructuring as the reason. Even more layoffs have happened without that explicit statement, with AI hinted at as the reason. But critics point out that many of these same companies overhired during the pandemic and are now using AI as a convenient scapegoat for necessary correction. Rather than admitting to their own poor planning, they're trying to blame the technology. What's particularly revealing is the language they're using. Vague terms like optimization, efficiency, or realignment, trying to obscure what's really happening. And here's the psychological disconnect. AI could be deployed to augment human workers, enhancing productivity in ways that could enable the shorter work weeks and better work-life balance that studies have shown works well. Research on human-AI collaboration shows substantial potential for expanding worker capabilities rather than replacing them entirely, but that would require viewing employees as assets to invest in rather than costs to eliminate. It would mean using productivity gains to improve quality of life rather than simply padding corporate profit margins. The choice to use AI for mass layoffs rather than workforce enhancement reveals the same short-term, financially driven thinking that drives RTO mandates in general. It's not about what's possible, it's about what's easiest for the bottom line this quarter. If the RTO push represents a backward step, then the 4-day workweek represents the future. Iceland ran one of the most extensive experiments in the world between 2015 and 2019, involving over 2,500 workers, or about 1% of the country's working population. Workers shifted from a 40-hour week to a 35 or 36-hour week with no pay cut. The results were remarkable. Productivity not only held steady, but in many cases improved. Stress and burnout fell significantly, job satisfaction went up, and workers reported better work-life balance and more time for family, hobbies, and rest. More recently, the UK ran a large-scale pilot in 2022 involving 61 companies and about 2,900 workers across multiple industries. After 6 months, 92% of the companies decided to keep the 4-day week. Employee well-being scores improved dramatically. Burnout and fatigue decreased, anxiety and stress symptoms dropped. Companies reported that revenue stayed stable or even increased during the trial period. Turnover fell by an average of 57% compared to the same period the previous year. The psychological logic is straightforward. Rest is not the opposite of work. Rest is what makes sustained, creative, effective work possible. Our brains aren't designed for constant output. We need recovery time to consolidate learning, process information, and restore cognitive resources. When people have more time for their families, hobbies, and communities, they bring more energy and focus to their jobs. They're less likely to burn out and they're more engaged when they are working. There's also an equity dimension here that deserves our attention. Studies of the 4-day workweek show improvements in gender equity within households. When both partners have more non-work time, the distribution of domestic labor becomes more balanced. Women report being able to engage more fully in both paid and unpaid work without the crushing weight of doing it all. Men report being more involved in caregiving and household management. The rigid structure of the 5-day, 40-plus hour week has always disadvantaged caregivers who are disproportionately women. Shorter work weeks begin to correct that imbalance. Universal basic income experiments point in the same direction. Finland ran a 2-year trial from 2017 to 2019, giving 2,000 randomly selected unemployed people a guaranteed monthly payment of 560 euros with no strings attached. The results showed better mental health, less stress, higher trust in institutions, and greater life satisfaction among recipients compared to the control group. Critically, the guaranteed income didn't reduce motivation to work. Recipients were just as likely to find employment as the control group, but they experienced significantly less anxiety and financial stress during the process. In the United States, Stockton, California ran the SEED program, or Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, giving 125 residents $500 per month for 2 years with no restrictions. Critics predicted the money would be wasted on frivolities, and they were wrong. Recipients paid down their debt, bought food, covered utility bills, and invested in education and childcare. The psychological benefits were substantial. Full-time employment among recipients increased. Anxiety and depression scores dropped, and recipients reported feeling more hopeful about the future and more capable of handling financial shocks. This shouldn't surprise anyone familiar with the hierarchy of needs theory by Maslow. When basic survival is taken care of and you know you can feed your family, keep a roof over your head, you have the psychological space to think beyond immediate threats. This allows you to plan and invest in relationships and take risks that might improve your situation. Scarcity doesn't just affect your bank account, it shrinks your mental bandwidth. It keeps you in a state of constant vigilance and stress. Security expands that mental bandwidth. It lets you think clearly and act strategically rather than reactively. UBI is basically a large-scale stress reduction intervention with downstream effects on health, relationships, and economic participation. Rest is another piece of this puzzle we've mentioned. Neuroscience research has shown repeatedly that rest isn't wasted time. Sleep, downtime, and recovery periods allow our brains to consolidate memories, generate creative solutions, and regulate our emotions. Research on sleep illustrates how even a single night of poor rest impairs attention, working memory, and problem solving. Chronic sleep deprivation is linked to everything from cardiovascular disease to mental health disorders and decreased immune function. Rest isn't optional, it's a biological necessity. But beyond the neuroscience, there's also a cultural and political dimension. Activist and theologian Tricia Hersey, founder of the NAP ministry, argues that rest is a form of resistance against systems that exploit human labor. In her work, which draws on Black liberation theology and social justice traditions, rest becomes a radical act of reclaiming humanity in a culture that treats people as units of production. The glorification of hustle, the shame around needing downtime, the expectation of constant availability aren't natural or inevitable. They're cultural choices that serve specific power structures. For marginalized communities in particular, rest becomes both a health necessity and a political statement. Communities that have been historically overworked and undercompensated, from enslaved people to exploited laborers to modern service workers grinding through multiple jobs, are disproportionately harmed by cultures that devalue rest. Choosing rest, insisting on rest, making rest accessible is therefore an act of both resistance and healing. Psychology and sociology both point to the same conclusion. Rest restores us not only as workers, but as people. It allows us to connect with others, engage with our communities, and remember that we exist for reasons beyond economic productivity. Burnout isn't a personal failing, it's a structural problem that requires structural solutions, and rest is central to those solutions. The benefits of remote and flexible work ripple out into families in significant ways. Survey research has found that those working from home reported more satisfaction with family time, better work-life balance, and less overall stress. They felt more present with their children and their partners. They could manage household responsibilities more effectively. They had more time for the relationships that matter most. Commuting has been consistently linked to negative outcomes across multiple domains. Research shows that long commutes are associated with higher blood pressure, worse mood, increased anxiety, and even higher divorce rates. Studies from Sweden found that people with commutes longer than 45 minutes had a 40% higher risk of divorce compared to those with shorter commutes. Every additional minute of commuting time decreases job satisfaction and increases strain on relationships. Cutting out the commute isn't just about saving time. It's about eliminating a daily source of stress and frustration that accumulates over time. And there's a health benefit we rarely talk about directly: infectious disease. Offices are vectors for illness. Flu, RSV, strep throat, measles, COVID, the common cold, all spread more easily in enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, lack of air filtration, and close contact between people. Remote work reduces exposure to these illnesses dramatically, which means fewer sick days, less presenteeism where people come to work ill for no reason, and critically, less stress for caregivers worried about vulnerable family members at home. If you have a child with asthma, an elderly parent, or an immunocompromised partner going through some kind of treatment for cancer or other illnesses, the psychological relief of not having to weigh, do I risk my health and my family's health for a job, is enormous. Contrast that with the undertone of some executives who often seem to resent the families they built because convention told them to, rather than genuine desire. There seems to be a particular bitterness that emerges sometimes when some leaders talk about workers wanting to be home with their families. It suggests projection, a resentment of their own choices being imposed on others. Flexible work is not just about convenience. It's about keeping people healthy and relationships strong, and acknowledging that people have lives outside of work, and those lives matter. One of the most influential studies of team dynamics comes from Google's Project Aristotle. After years of analysis involving hundreds of teams, researchers found that the single best predictor of team performance wasn't raw intelligence, technical expertise, or even time spent together. It was psychological safety, the sense that you can take risks, share ideas, admit mistakes, and be yourself without fear of punishment or humiliation. Research on psychological safety defines it as a climate where people feel comfortable being and expressing themselves. In psychologically safe environments, people speak up with concerns, ask for help when needed, and offer dissenting opinions respectfully. Innovation happens because people aren't afraid to propose unusual ideas. Problems get solved faster because people aren't hiding their failures. Flexible work structures, shorter hours, and universal basic income all contribute to this safety. They create a context where people can breathe, where they aren't constantly in fight or flight mode, and where they feel trusted by their organizations. When you're not worried about losing your job for asking to work from home, or being judged for needing mental health time, or penalized for having caregiving responsibilities, you can focus on just doing good work rather than on self-protection. This is also deeply generational. Younger Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z are vocal about wanting authenticity, balance, and meaning at work. They watched their parents sacrifice relationships, health, and happiness for jobs that showed no loyalty in return. They saw and lived through the 2008 financial crisis, the gig economy, and the pandemic. and watch them expose the fragility of the old employment contract. They're not willing to accept work first, life second, and they're not apologizing for it. These generations want to work for organizations whose values align with their own. They want flexibility, mental health support, diverse and inclusive cultures, and work that feels meaningful. Organizations that ignore this shift aren't just missing a perk or failing to attract talent, they're ignoring the foundation of future high performance. Psychological safety isn't a soft skill, it's strategic, and it requires structures that respect people's full humanity, not just their productive capacity. Step back for a moment and ask, why do we work the way we do? So many of our assumptions about work hours, office locations, and productivity metrics are relics of the industrial era. In fact, unions gave us the 8-hour workday, the 5-day week, and the central office. They were all designed to solve problems on the factory floors and assembly lines where physical presence and synchronized schedules were necessary for production, but companies and bosses mistreated and overworked workers in unsafe conditions. Knowledge work, as we know it today, is fundamentally different and requires creativity, collaboration, and deep focus, none of which are best supported by rigid schedules and constant surveillance. And don't get me wrong, we still need those guardrails on companies so they don't abuse workers that must be physically present. And in fact, we could do a whole episode on how to solve some of the problems we uncovered in the pandemic's early days faced by essential workers, service workers, healthcare workers, and teachers. But this is about office work. Speaking of the pandemic, still ongoing, but early days especially were a brutal global crisis that caused immense suffering and loss, and also opened a window into different ways of working. Millions of people discovered that we can do our jobs without commutes, cubicles, or constant oversight. For many, health improved, relationships deepened, and engagement with the community grew. The myth that productivity requires an office presence was definitively debunked. Rolling back these gains out of fear, nostalgia, or lease obligations is not leadership, it's regression. Real leadership means looking at the evidence and adapting, even when it's uncomfortable. It means acknowledging that the early days of the pandemic forced us into an experiment we might never have tried voluntarily, and that experiment revealed better ways of organizing work. If work is supposed to serve life, if the purpose of economic activity is human flourishing, then we need to be honest about what serves life best, and the evidence on that is clear. We've now covered how working from home, shorter weeks, basic income, and rest aren't just perks or nice-to-haves. They're scientifically proven ways to create healthier, happier, more productive lives. The push for mandatory office time is less about culture and collaboration and more about fear, sunk cost, and sometimes even a backdoor way to push people out without calling it what it is. But the evidence is overwhelming. Autonomy drives motivation. Flexibility improves well-being. Rest enables sustained performance, and psychological safety predicts high-performing teams. Meeting our basic needs frees up our cognitive resources. These aren't radical ideas, they're just basic psychology applied to work. Life first, work second isn't just a catchy phrase, it's the way forward. The question isn't whether these models work, the evidence already answers that. The question is whether we'll demand them and refuse to settle for outdated, harmful work models. Thanks for listening to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. As always, subscribe so you don't miss a week. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, share Cyberspace with a friend. Until next time, stay curious.